Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're looking today at, well, one of history's strangest paradoxes. 1945 ends this massive global war.
Only to immediately kick off another kind of conflict. A decades-long tension, really, that put the whole world under the shadow of nuclear war.
Exactly. We're diving into the Cold War from 1945 right through to 1991.
And we've got a pretty comprehensive set of sources here. Our goal, really, is to synthesize these 46 years, to track how the conflict, the containment strategies, and eventually détente evolved.
At its heart, it was this fundamental clash, wasn't it? The U.S. championing capitalism, democracy.
Versus the USSR pushing communism and state control, a clash of systems.
But our sources suggest, and this is key, I think, that it's not just about the big weapons or the spies, fascinating as they are.
No, not entirely. It's really about how military tech, crucial leadership decisions, and maybe most importantly, the underlying economic health of these two superpowers shaped everything.
Right, and how that led to the eventual outcome, which amazingly wasn't a nuclear fireball.
That's the core idea we want to explore, how this ideological split happened so fast and pushed the world, right to the edge.
It really is amazing how quickly that wartime Grand Alliance just disintegrated.
It happened between Yalta and Potsdam. Roosevelt dies, Churchill's voted out, Truman and Attlee come in.
Yeah.
Suddenly, dealing with Stalin feels very different.
Especially regarding Eastern Europe, yeah. Poland, Germany. Stalin's intentions became much clearer, or at least perceived differently.
The trust just evaporated. Stalin was insisting on this buffer zone in Eastern Europe, and this led directly to George Kennan's famous long telegram in '46.
A warning signal.
Right, basically saying Soviet expansion is kind of baked into their system, it's inevitable, and the West needed firm resistance, containment.
And that private warning quickly became public policy. Churchill gives his Iron Curtain speech that same year, basically drawing a line across Europe.
Which then solidified into the Truman Doctrine. America saying, okay, we will support any nation resisting communist pressure. Greece was the first big test case.
Now, some sources do argue, don't they, that Stalin's moves were more defensive. Like, after being invaded twice in devastating world wars, maybe he just wanted security, and the U.S. sort of overreacted.
That's definitely a debate in the sources. Was it inherently expansionist or primarily defensive paranoia? Hard to say definitively.
Yeah.
But whatever the motive, the Western response was strategic containment.
And economic, too. The Marshall Plan in 1947, that was huge.
Absolutely massive. $13 billion, which was an enormous sum, then offered to rebuild war-torn Europe. The idea was, prosperity inoculates against communism, prevent it taking root in desperation.
Containment through cash, essentially.
You could say that.
Yeah.
But Stalin saw it as, well, American economic imperialism. He flat out forbade the Eastern European countries from accepting the aid.
And that tension just boiled over in Berlin, didn't it?
Right. Germany was divided into 4 zones, remember? When the Western powers decided to unify their zones economically and introduce a new currency.
Stalin saw it as a threat.
He retaliated. June 1948, the Berlin blockade. He cut off all road, rail, canal access to West Berlin, trying to starve them out, basically.
And here's where containment gets interesting. The West didn't send tanks.
No, they launched the Berlin airlift.
Yeah.
For nearly a year, American and British planes flew in everything. Food, fuel, medicine, nonstop flights.
It was an incredible logistical feat. And it worked. It showed Western resolve, made Stalin back down, and, well, directly led to the formal split of Germany, didn't it?
Yep. By 1949, you have West Germany, the FRG, and East Germany, the GDR, separate states.
And that same year, the military lines are drawn with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
So containment seemed to work in Europe, at least initially. The Berlin airlift was a big win.
But then the focus shifts dramatically. What happens when this containment idea has to stretch globally?
Asia becomes the new flashpoint. It starts with the massive shock in the West when China falls to Mao Zedong's communists in 1949.
Suddenly, the most populous nation on Earth is communist. That must have terrified Washington.
It changed everything. Containment wasn't just European anymore. It had to be global. And that commitment gets tested almost immediately in Korea.
The Korean War, 1950 to 53, starts with the North invading the South.
Right. And the UN steps in partly because the Soviets were boycotting the Security Council at the time, so they couldn't veto.
But then, as UN forces push north towards the Chinese border,
China jumps in, sends hundreds of thousands of troops, pushes the UN forces back. The war eventually settles into this bloody stalemate roughly around the original dividing line, the 38th parallel.
And this war really cements the domino theory in American thinking.
Absolutely. The idea that if one country falls to communism, its neighbors will inevitably follow, like dominoes. This justifies interventions all over, including, crucially, in Vietnam, which gets divided at the 17th parallel after the French defeat in 1954.
And this fear wasn't just shaping foreign policy, it seeped into domestic life, too.
Oh, definitely. You get things like McCarthyism in the U.S., the Red Scare, intense paranoia about communists infiltrating the government, Hollywood, everywhere.
While all this is happening, the technology of war is changing terrifyingly fast.
Yeah, this is where mutual assured destruction, or MAD, comes in. It's driven by the development of ICBM's intercontinental ballistic missiles.
Missiles that could fly across continents in minutes. What did that actually mean for strategy?
It meant, fundamentally, that there was no winning a nuclear war. A first strike by one side would absolutely guarantees a devastating retaliatory strike from the other. There was no defense.
So survival depended on neither side blinking.
Precisely. And then the Soviets deliver another shock Sputnik in 1957, the first satellite.
Followed by Yuri Gagarin, the first man in space, in 1961.
Right. This wasn't just about prestige, though it was that too. It suggested maybe that Soviet missile technology was actually ahead of the U.S. It created this huge sense of vulnerability in America.
And spurred massive investment in science, education, the space race.
Exactly. Meanwhile, back in Europe, the division becomes brutally physical. August 1961, the East Germans build the Berlin Wall.
Literally overnight, just sealing off East Berlin from the West.
To stop the brain drain. Essentially, hundreds of thousands, mostly skilled workers, had been fleeing the economic stagnation of the East through West Berlin. The wall became this ultimate symbol of oppression.
And all these pressures, the arms race, Berlin, the global competition, they culminate in maybe the most dangerous moment of the entire Cold War.
Cuba, October 1962.
Set the scene. Castro's revolution in '59, America's failed attempt to overthrow him at the Bay of Pigs in '61.
And then U.S. spy planes discover the Soviets are secretly installing nuclear missile sites in Cuba, just 90 miles off the coast of Florida.
The 13 days. The world held its breath. Kennedy imposes a naval blockade, a quarantine.
It was incredibly tense. We now know from the sources just how close they came to catastrophe, possibly through miscalculation or accident.
But eventually, a deal was struck. Khrushchev agreed publicly to remove the missiles.
In exchange for a U.S. promise not to invade Cuba. But there was a secret part too, right?
Yes, the U.S. also agreed to quietly remove its own Jupiter missiles from Turkey, which were basically analogous to the Soviet missiles in Cuba.
That close call, that near-death experience for the planet, it did have one positive outcome. It scared both sides.
Led directly to the hotline, didn't it? A direct communication link between Washington and Moscow to prevent misunderstandings in a crisis.
Exactly, a small step, but crucial. It marks a slight shift, maybe, towards managing the conflict, even as it continued elsewhere.
But before things really eased, the U.S. got drawn much, much deeper into Vietnam.
Yeah, the commitment escalated massively under President Johnson, especially after the alleged Gulf of Tonkin incident. Troop levels eventually went over 500,000.
And the sources highlight this real asymmetry. The U.S. had overwhelming firepower, air superiority, technology.
But the NLF, the National Liberation Front, or Viet Cong, used guerrilla tactics incredibly effectively. They controlled the countryside, blended with the population. It was a war the U.S. military wasn't really prepared for.
Then came the Tet Offensive in 1968.
Militarily, it was actually a failure for the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong. They took huge losses. But psychologically, it was devastating for the U.S. war effort.
How so?
Because it showed the American public that despite years of fighting and optimistic reports, the enemy could still launch massive attacks across South Vietnam, even hitting the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. It shattered the idea that the war was being won.
Public opinion turned sharply against the war. Nixon comes in, promising peace with honor.
His strategy was Vietnamization, build up the South Vietnamese army, so U.S. troops could withdraw. He also pursued diplomacy, famously opening relations with China in 1972. That triangular diplomacy put pressure on the Soviets, too.
The U.S. finally withdraws after the Paris Peace Accords in 1973. But it wasn't peace with honor for the South, was it?
No. Within 2 years, North Vietnam launched a final offensive, and Saigon fell in April 1975. The war ended with a communist victory.
So, after the trauma of Vietnam, and with both sides facing economic strains, we enter a period called détente, an easing of tensions.
Yeah, roughly from the early 70s to 79. Was it just war weariness, or was it something more fundamental driving it?
The sources suggest it was both. The fear of nuclear war, heightened by AMA, was definitely a factor. You see actual arms control treaties being signed.
Like the Moscow Test Ban Treaty back in '63, limiting nuclear testing. The Non-Proliferation Treaty, trying to stop the spread of nuclear weapons.
And importantly, the SALT talks, strategic arms limitation talks. SALT First and SALT Tooth aim to put caps on the number of nuclear launchers each side could have.
There were also political agreements, like the Helsinki Accords in 1975. These recognized existing European borders a big deal for the Soviets, but also included commitments on human rights, which the West hoped would push for change inside the Eastern Bloc.
And we can't forget the China factor here. The split between the USSR and China was deep by this point.
The Sino-Soviet split. That changed the whole game, didn't it? It wasn't just US versus USSR anymore. Nixon's visit to China in '72 exploited that brilliantly. It gave the U.S. more leverage against Moscow.
But this era of cooperation, Datan, it didn't last. It crashed and burned pretty spectacularly.
The turning point, almost universally cited in the sources, is the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979.
Why did they go in?
To prop up a failing communist government there that was facing a major insurgency, the Mujahideen. But it turned into a disaster for them, a bloody decade-long war. Their own Vietnam, really.
And the U.S. response was?
Furious. Carter withdrew the SALT-TECA Treaty from Senate consideration, boycotted the 1980 Moscow Olympics, and then Reagan gets elected.
Reagan takes a much harder line, calls the USSR an evil empire, ramps up military spending again.
This period, roughly 1979 to 1985, is often called the Second Cold War. Tensions were incredibly high again. You had incidents like the shooting down of the Korean airliner KAL-07 in 1983 after it strayed into Soviet airspace. A real tragedy that deepened mistrust.
So the common narrative is often that Reagan's military buildup bankrupted the Soviets and won the Cold War. But you mentioned Afghanistan. The sources seem to point towards deeper internal problems in the USSR.
That's crucial. Yes, Reagan's pressure didn't help them. But the Soviet system was already creaking under its own weight. Decades of inefficient central planning, the massive unsustainable cost of the arms race over 40 years, plus the drain of Afghanistan.
The system was simply failing economically.
Fundamentally, they couldn't keep up technologically or financially. So when Mikhail Gorbachev came to power in 1985, he knew something drastic had to change. His reforms weren't about ideology initially, they were about survival.
These were glasnost and perestroika.
Right. Glasnost means openness, allowing more freedom of speech, challenging history, criticizing the government. Perestroika was economic restructuring, trying to introduce some market mechanisms, decentralize control, make the economy work better.
But opening the door a little?
Unleashed forces he couldn't control. People didn't just want a slightly better version of communism, they wanted real freedom. And economically, perestroika arguably made things worse in the short term, causing more disruption.
And politically, the absolute game changer was Gorbachev abandoning the Brezhnev Doctrine.
Yes. That was the implicit, sometimes explicit, Soviet promise to use military force to keep communist regimes in power in Eastern Europe, like they did in Hungary in '56 and Czechoslovakia in '68.
Gorbachev basically said, we're not going to intervene anymore, your path is your own.
And that was the green light. Suddenly the regimes in Eastern Europe realized the Soviet tanks weren't coming, and they just crumbled, one after another, incredibly quickly in 1989.
Poland, Hungary, East Germany, leading to the most iconic moment, the fall of the Berlin Wall on November 9th, 1989.
An unbelievable night. People literally dancing on the wall, followed by things like the peaceful Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. It was like a reverse domino effect.
And the end came remarkably fast after that.
Just weeks later at the Malta summit, President George H.W. Bush and Gorbachev basically declared the Cold War over.
And the formal end.
Christmas Day, December 25, 1991. Gorbachev resigns, the Soviet flag is lowered over the Kremlin for the last time, and the USSR officially ceases to exist, just like that.
So, looking back across this whole epic sweep, what's the main takeaway?
I think it's that this whole era was defined by this constant nerve-wracking balance between ideology, this belief in diametrically opposed systems, and the sheer military reality of MD, which forced a degree of pragmatism.
But the end wasn't really about a military victory, was it?
Not directly. The sources really emphasize the internal factors. The Soviet Union collapsed primarily because of its own deep-seated economic failures and its inability to compete technologically and financially over the long haul. The system just couldn't sustain the burden.
So the lesson for you listening might be that systemic problems, things like economic stagnation and unsustainable military spending, can ultimately be more decisive in resolving global conflicts than brute force alone.
And here's something to really chew on. In those final years, from 85 to 91, you see Gorbachev and Reagan, then Bush, actually negotiating the elimination of an entire class of nuclear weapons, the intermediate-range missiles with the INF Treaty.
That was the first time they agreed to reduce arsenals, not just limit their growth.
It's exactly
Mhm.
a real reduction. So, thinking back to how close they came to annihilation over Cuba in '62, what does this final, almost cooperative push for disarmament tell us about the impact individual leaders can have? How much did their personal choices, their willingness to step back from the brink, actually shape the peaceful end of this terrifying era? That's something worth pondering.